Peace be unto you. I'm your host, Abdullah Muslim, and this is Islam Works. You know, the emphasis of this program is how people use Islam on a daily basis. And the reason that we don't use the word practice is because in Western societies, when you practice something, after practice is finished, you go back to your normal routine. Within the Muslim community, using Islam is the normal routine. You can use Islam or you can implement certain aspects of it. But essentially, that's why we use the word use. And we have our brother from North America, from Brooklyn, New York, as a matter of fact, Safwan El-Hadi. Did I say that correct, Doc?
Yes, you did.
Okay. And unlike our guests in the past, he was born into Islam. He was born a Muslim. He was born to Muslim parents in Brooklyn, New York. And I think he has some interesting experiences to share with us, and perhaps it'll be helpful to understand how Islam is actually a sanctuary, a place of refuge. And actually we seek refuge in Allah, but Allah has given us Islam as like a cushion or a place of comfort to be able to find our ways through whatever difficulties we may be facing. All right, Brother Safwan?
Yes. So exactly, you know, Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. I start with the name of God.
Of course.
And I also send peace and blessings upon the last prophet of Islam and his family and his companions all the way into the last day. Hopefully we can share with our audience some experiences or some information that will help them understand that Islam is not a cultural,
it doesn't belong to any one group of people. It's
right.
For the whole of humanity. Is that what you mean?
That's what I mean.
Okay.
It's not something, like you said, it belongs to all of humanity, and it was given, it's a divine, you know, divinely sent way of life by God, the Creator.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not something that was made up as man lives and goes along in the annals of time.
Okay, well, you know, when you were born in Brooklyn, it must have been very interesting, you know. You went to school with Muslims or with non-Muslims?
Well, back in the 1970s, I was born in 70 itself, so
okay.
50 years ago, 51 years ago. And those days, Islam, according to, you know, what we now know as some people might call it Orthodox Islam, some
mm-hmm.
people might call it the pure Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Islam itself is pure.
Okay.
It's a pure way of life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, of course, you as a human being, we as human beings can take it for ourselves and live from the, you know, live aspects of it to help better ourselves, men, women, children. In the 1970s, though, it was not as widespread in the West as it is today.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
So yes, and in the 1970s and 1980s, the Muslims were more had found this Islam to be useful to their lives in helping them change themselves.
Okay.
You know, men, women, of all walks of life.
That's true.
And so, yeah, they had come together in different parts of the West, in different parts of the United States, particularly in New York, and had come together and try to form a community in the best way that we could, or they could. I'm talking about my parents and that generation, or the generation that had come before them. And yes, we had a school, we had different places, like butcher shops, and we had a butcher shop. We had little stores, grocery stores, and it was quite a vibrant community.
Did you find that there were people from outside the community, people who were not Muslims, who were coming into specifically your area to buy the food, the products that you had in those stores?
Well, because the community itself was not an exclusive community, when we say community here, it wasn't like a gated-in community or away from the common people. It was rather in the middle of Bed-Stuy.
Okay.
You know, so that's where our masjid or our mosque was. And so, yes, there were people who would come because a store is a store on the corner. You know, if you have groceries, people are going to come and they're going to support the store.
The reason I asked that question is because in a lot of the places where I traveled in the U.S., the Muslims were known for carrying good products. Their meat was always, good. Chickens and stuff like that were always considered fresh, and which they were because of the way we slaughter. And the items that we carried were always unique and different. And also our prices were also known oftentimes to be reasonable. So if you wanted something different or something that was good for you, something healthy, okay, I found this even in London, okay, and I remember reading, in fact, I remember an incident, I'll try to get through this quickly, when I was working for Pan American Airlines, when the Chinese first began to, were first accepted, were brought into the UN and brought into the business community at the beginning with President Richard Nixon. And one of the areas where I was working, they had some Chinese technicians come, and I was one of the people that was helping to train them. And when they found out I was a Muslim, they were like really, one of them spoke pretty good English, and he wanted to talk to me a lot. And he was telling me how good the Muslims in China were. And, it's not just the Uyghurs. There are many different communities of Muslims in China.
No doubt.
Okay? And he said that, their food is good, and, they do this and they do that. And I also recognize that, China, being a communist country, didn't have a capitalist system. In other words, when you did a business, it was for the good of the state. All right, you couldn't look for personal gain. But when the Chinese government relinquished control over the business life, the first people that they opened it up for were Muslims.
Right.
So that's the reason I asked, because it's something I just kind of observed, in the as I traveled throughout the Muslim world.
I see.
And in Brooklyn, I was just wondering if you ran across something similar to that.
Right. In Brooklyn, in those days, because I was so young, in looking back, I can say that I had thought that it was a norm for the Muslims to have their own businesses. Because I was quite young. I was in elementary school. We had I'd come from the community, what is now known as the Darul Islam community, or some people call it movement. We were just trying to be a community of Muslims who practiced what we knew to be what was said in the Quran and what we found in the hadiths, which were the access to hadiths in those days was not as easy.
Right, you had to go to Manhattan, I believe, to find a good Islamic bookstore.
Well, before there were bookstores, before there were bookstores that had become widespread, my father had to reach out to Karachi, Pakistan, and order books from there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because, you know, like for myself, I remember when the Nation of Islam first came into Islam and started practicing Islam,
Right,
okay, as given to us by Allah and His Prophet.
right.
The brothers from Pakistan sent, a mountain of books, okay, and they were all good books, you know, yeah.
So, you know, as a lot of people may not know, before the books that we now know to come from the Middle East were popular, you know, translated books, a lot of translated books, they all came out of Pakistan.
Pakistan, yeah.
You know, and Pakistan was the hub.
How have you found, all right, growing up, as you grow and you developed, all right, in New York City, in Brooklyn, how have you found Islam helping you as you walk through the various neighborhoods there? I remember I used to go and visit my uncle in Brooklyn, and he, the neighborhood where he lived on Bedford Avenue, okay? And it was rough. It was right, as I recall, if you continued straight down Bedford, at the end of the, I mean, a good ways, Prospect Park was around that area there.
Okay, yes.
Okay, and it was just it was a rough area.
It's all according to, you said Bedford Avenue, wasn't far from, you had City College down there.
Right.
You had Prospect Heights in those areas.
Okay,
The
but
Prospect
the area,
Parks.
was it a rough area?
Flatbush.
Flatbush.
That was Flatbush.
Okay, yeah.
And, or Crown Heights, it's all
Okay.
according to where you're talking about.
Okay,
Bedford Avenue, I couldn't say if it was rough in the earlier days. When I say earlier days, maybe 70s, 80s,
okay.
it was a very, very, very nice, quiet area.
Okay.
Flatbush, East Flatbush, very nice.
Okay.
The rougher areas would have been your Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, which was like in the borderline, you know, before you got to Flatbush. And you had nice areas in Crown Heights. You had Brownsville,
But what I'm trying
East
to
New
get
York.
to is, how did you manage, and how did the Muslims in that area manage to avoid the problems of Brooklyn? Don't tell me Brooklyn was, you know, I've spent time in Brooklyn.
From what I understand, you know, Brooklyn was a very rough place at one point, but you
I
know,
mean, keep in mind Siraj Wahaj, Imam Siraj Wahaj, and what those brothers did, what they had to do to get the drugs and stuff out of the neighborhood.
in the late 80s, early 90s,
Okay.
particularly early 90s,
Which
reestablishing.
was practical, because what happened was once they cleaned up that neighborhood, people started moving back, because it
Yes.
was like it had almost become like a wasteland.
In the 1970s, in all of the 80s, or all of the 70s, late
Okay.
60s, all of the 70s, and early 80s, the Muslims, most of the Muslims were reverts, had converted or reverted, as they say, to Islam. But that took hard work. That took standing your ground. That took, you know, Muslim men asking drug addicts to, you know, leave off the drugs. Long
Now,
story short.
this is an interesting point you just brought out. Muslim men asking drug addicts to leave it off, as opposed to calling in the police, okay, who sometimes became part of the problem, okay, and it's that they would, you know, they would take the money, take the drugs, and leave the dealers and the addicts.
Well, there was a consciousness.
Not all the
that-
time, but oft times. When I know that the Muslims, what they would do, all right, is they would just stand on the corner as a group where they knew that drugs were being dealt, and these dealers would move away, and they just kept doing that until they eventually left the neighborhood. It seems like there's a social program there someplace.
Well, there's a consciousness that did exist. You gotta remember.
Did exist or does exist?
Did exist.
Okay.
Then. That probably doesn't exist now, where there was, the drugs weren't as widespread. You're talking about dope and people were sniffing glue in the late 60s, early 70s.
Okay.
Excuse me, throughout the 70s. Where, people were proud to be who they were in the black communities, proud to be black, as you can see.
Black Panthers.
Yeah, the Black Panthers. You had the, like I said, everybody was kind of black and proud. You had the civil rights movement, So when the Muslims came along, and Islam had reached the Muslims, this was good. This was something that felt good because it was guidance. It is guidance. So people used that to better themselves. And those who had learned a little more about Islam, like my father and his peers, they began to call people to Islam, to the Quran and to the Sunnah, to La ilaha illallah. We didn't have a large, what we in the West, or what some people may call foreign community, meaning people from outside of America, from Muslim countries, from Arab countries,
from Asian countries, and what have you.
Arab, Asia, and African countries.
Okay.
We didn't have a lot of them then.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Yeah.
So
it came later. It came during the Carter administration.
Right. So they, in those days, there was just this push to be a Muslim and be different from the non-Muslims and follow the guidance and
morally
call people
different.
to it. Morally, everything, morally, socially, politically, Islam was seen as guidance. It wasn't seen as a culture.
Now you keep using past tense. You say wasn't.
Well, nowadays, you have two or three generations in. So, nowadays, it's the opposite effect seems to be taking root. And that is a lot of people are taking for granted the guidance of Islam, and because Islam is not being passed down, has not been properly taught to the next generation like it was taken in. It's not taken as seriously. So what happens is you become complacent, like many Muslim countries. Even myself, growing up as a Muslim, you start to take for granted the actual guidance of Islam. You see, it's a guidance and not just a preferred way of life.
So you're saying that in some instances, because I don't find this out in Long Island, at least not out in the areas where my sons live. I find that what you're saying is that Muslims in some places are taking the attitude that Christians had, that, I'm a Muslim, I'm saved.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And unfortunately, that's a growing sentiment.
And that's not true.
No, it's very untrue.
You got to work. You got to work for this day.
Yep, Allah.
You got to work for your salvation.
God has made His guidance something that everyone must choose willingly, and so that's why we were given the power of choice after have been given the free will that we all have. So now you can make a choice and choose once it's given to you between right and wrong. Islam itself is not something that can be inherited. It has to be taught.
Choice. It's a choice.
It's a choice. You have to learn it. You have to live what you know of it. Once you learn about Allah, once you learn about God, then you try your level best from your human ability to follow the guidance.
And to live up to those standards.
And live up to those standards.
I saw something one time. There was in Manhattan, there was a brother and his wife. This was about maybe after I was here, about 30. Whenever I go home, I always go to Juma in Manhattan or Brooklyn. And the brother came in one day, and I used to see him up and down the streets. He was a hustler. Hustler meaning somebody who was involved in irregular work.
An entrepreneur of
Yeah,
sorts.
an entrepreneur of crime.
Okay.
Okay. And he came in, he had his wife and he had his children with him. And they were in, the wife, she had on like a semi-mini skirt, and, you get the idea, okay? And the brother, he said, he looked at us, he everybody's looking like, this is Juma, what's he doing here? And after Juma was over, he and his wife and his children came up front. And he says, I see you people every day. You come out, you're clean, you're nice, you're presentable, you're very, he didn't use the word civilized, but civil, okay? I can't think of exactly what he said. He says, and I want my family to be like yours. I want my family to be like you all. He says, so I talked to my wife, I talked to my children, and we're going to become Muslims. This was more than 30 years ago, right after I came here. So what happened was, they took Shahada as a family. I went home about 10 years or so ago. Not only were they still there, but if you saw them, you would never have recognized them for what they had been as a family. You understand what I'm saying?
Right.
Okay. And, in that light, I had seen similar things at Taqwa Masjid in Brooklyn.
Right.
Okay. And, and the thing is that Islam had brought dignity back into people's lives.
Right.
With all the fitna we have, this is what I observed, it brings that dignity back. It brings that sense of self-esteem.
Right.
And your expectations become, one of, things can be better.
Right.
And this is one of the things that I found that Islam does. It gives you hope. It gives you a sense of, okay, well, it happened this way today.
Right.
But I know that things are going to improve.
Right.
And, I just make my prayers and go about my business.
Well, Islam connects you to God. It connects you to God. And so a person who's not connected to God, he's not going to have that outlook on life that things are going to be better. It's God who tells us that things are going to be better in different parts of his word and Quran and stuff.
Okay.
So
yeah, and that's why we say Islam works. It gives you a correct perspective on God. It gives a correct perspective on what your relationship is with God.
Right.
Okay. And even if you're born into Islam, or if it's something that you begin to, you accept at a later time of your life, right? Still, you find that it's something that has helped you to get through many difficulties, and to enter into a state of sakina, tranquility, when you're surrounded by a whirlwind of difficulties. Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And may the peace that comes from the heart and the mind be with you. Islam works.